It began with a bathroom break. Not a grant proposal, not a satellite scan, not years of careful planning pointed at one exact coordinate on a map. A man simply stepped out of a vehicle to relieve himself in a dry gorge in the northern Flinders Ranges of South Australia, and in doing so, he stumbled into a discovery that would force scientists to rewrite the timeline of human life on this continent. What he found that day would eventually be dated to roughly 49,000 years old, making it the oldest confirmed site of human occupation ever excavated in Australia's arid interior. To understand why this discovery matters, you first have to understand the ground it was found on. The Flinders Ranges are ancient beyond easy comprehension, built from rock that has existed for the better part of 1 billion years. Long before anything with a spine crawled onto dry land, before the first tree took root anywhere on the planet, the deep folds and ridgelines of this landscape were already forming. By the time humans arrived here, the mountains had already been standing for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, and they have barely changed since. Every empire ever built by human hands rose and fell in what amounts to a blink against the age of this country. Rome rose, ruled, and crumbled. Egypt's pharaohs raised their monuments and were buried beneath them. Entire civilizations wrote their names into history and then vanished from it. Through all of it, these ranges simply endured, indifferent to everything happening on their surface. They are also unforgiving. The interior of the Flinders Ranges is hot, dry, and largely without reliable water. It is the kind of country that can kill a person in days if they don't know how to read it. And it was into this punishing landscape that a team from La Trobe University, led by archaeologist Giles Ham, ventured in 2011, hoping to learn more about how the earliest Australians had managed to live in such an extreme environment. Ham was working closely with the Adnyamathanha people, the traditional custodians of this land, and in particular with a respected elder named Clifford Coulthard, who had grown up on a nearby station and carried generations of local knowledge about the country. The two of them were surveying gorges together, looking for rock art and any physical trace of the deep past, when they came across a spring. In a landscape this dry, a permanent spring is not just a geological curiosity. It is the difference between a place where people could survive and a place where they could not. Water drawing steadily up out of the ground in the middle of arid country would have been one of the most valuable things in the entire region, and the rock walls around it bore the evidence of that value. They were marked with engravings, symbols pressed and scraped into the stone by generations of hands, some of them likely serving as a kind of signpost or claim, a way of telling anyone who came near that this water source was known, used, and not undefended. It was while investigating this spring and the gorge around it that Ham looked up and noticed something on the cliff face above. Roughly 20 meters up, tucked into the rock, was a shallow shelter with a ceiling stained almost black. That kind of staining does not happen by accident or overnight. It is the residue of fire, built up layer upon layer, the product of countless cooking fires lit in that exact spot over an extraordinary length of time. For anyone trained to read a landscape the way Ham was, a blackened roof like that is essentially a flashing sign that reads, "People lived here, and they lived here for a very long time." Getting up to the shelter itself required climbing a steep, loose slope, and when Ham and Coulthard reached it, they found the ground littered with stone artifacts, scattered across the surface, as if waiting to be noticed. The site was given a name that speaks to its Adnyamathanha custodians and its later excavation, and what followed was not a quick weekend dig but a sustained, careful, community-supported excavation carried out with the full approval of the Adnyamathanha Traditional Lands Association, whose members were directly involved in the fieldwork. This was never treated as simply an academic exercise performed on someone else's country. It was a collaboration, and the Adnyamathanha people were partners in uncovering their own deep history. When the team began digging, their first assumption was cautious. The sediment inside the shelter didn't run especially deep, and based on that alone, a rough guess put the site at somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 years old, which would already have been a solid, unremarkable result. Nothing about the surface appearance suggested they were standing above tens of thousands of years of continuous human history. That assumption did not survive contact with the evidence. As the excavation proceeded, the layers of the shelter floor began giving up their contents in a kind of reverse chronology, each stratum representing a sealed moment in time, undisturbed since the day it was buried beneath the next. Near the top were the kinds of things you might expect: worked stone flakes and blades, evidence of tool-making skill. But as the team moved deeper, the finds became more specific, more technically demanding, and considerably harder to explain if these people were supposed to be simple. Among the most striking discoveries was a small, carefully shaped bone point, ground down with real patience from the leg bone of a yellow-footed rock wallaby, a small native marsupial about the size of a large house cat. This single object would go on to be dated at roughly 40,000 to 38,000 years old, making it the oldest known bone tool ever recovered in Australia. Producing something like that is not a matter of striking one rock against another and hoping for a useful edge. It requires selecting the right bone, letting it dry, and then spending real time and attention grinding it down into a specific, functional shape, whether for use as an awl, a needle, or some other precision task. That kind of object only exists if the person making it already had a clear picture of the finished tool in their mind before they ever began. Alongside it, the team found evidence of hafted tools, stone blades deliberately fixed into wooden handles to create a more effective and controlled implement. Hafting is a genuine technological leap. It requires sourcing and shaping the stone correctly, preparing suitable wood, and then joining the two components in a way that can survive repeated use. According to the researchers, the hafted tools found at the site predate any other confirmed example of the same technology found anywhere else in Australia or Southeast Asia by thousands of years. In other words, people living in this remote desert shelter appear to have been using this technique before almost anyone else on record. Then there was the ochre. Red ochre and white gypsum pigment were recovered from the deepest, oldest layers of the excavation, evidence of body decoration or ritual use stretching back to some of the earliest phases of occupation. Across the ancient world, ochre use is frequently tied to ceremony, symbolism, and the treatment of the dead. Finding it this early at Wardii suggests that among the very first things these early inhabitants did in this shelter, they were already engaging in symbolic or ritual behavior, not simply focused on bare survival. The plant and animal remains told their own story. Fragments of quandong seed, a native desert fruit still eaten in the region today, turned up in the layers, pointing to a relationship between people and this particular food source that has apparently persisted, on and off, for tens of thousands of years. Emu eggshell fragments were also present, evidence that people were actively raiding nests in the surrounding country, a task that is far from trivial given how protective and physically capable adult emus can be. And running through multiple layers were bone fragments representing more than a dozen different animal species, showing a hunting economy that ranged widely across the local wildlife. But the single most consequential find in the whole excavation was a fragment of bone from a diprotodon, and specifically from a juvenile individual. Diprotodon was the largest marsupial that has ever lived, a distant, oversized relative of the modern wombat that could stand well over 1.5 meters at the shoulder and weigh close to 3 tons. It has been extinct for tens of thousands of years, one of the many giant species that made up Australia's now-vanished megafauna. Finding its remains in direct association with human tools and cooking evidence, in a habitation layer dated to the earliest period of the site's use, provided some of the clearest physical evidence anywhere on the continent that humans and megafauna genuinely overlapped in time and interacted directly. This was not proof of a single dramatic extinction event caused by hunting alone, but it firmly closed the door on the idea that early Australians never crossed paths with these giant animals at all. None of these individual objects would mean much without a reliable way to date them, so the research team used 2 completely independent dating techniques rather than relying on just one. Radiocarbon dating was applied to organic materials such as charcoal from ancient hearths and fragments of eggshell, measuring the breakdown of specific elements within the material over time. Separately, optically stimulated luminescence dating was applied to individual grains of quartz sediment, a technique that measures how long ago those grains were last exposed to sunlight before being buried. These 2 methods work on entirely different physical principles and were carried out without reference to each other's results, which makes it far more meaningful that they converged on the same answer. Layer after layer, the dates climbed, moving from around 20,000 years to 30,000 and ultimately down to a base occupation date of roughly 49,000 years before the present. That number did more than push back a regional record. It placed people living successfully in one of the most extreme interior environments on the Australian continent within just a few thousand years of humans first arriving anywhere on its shores. Archaeologists generally agree that people reached the northern coastline of Australia by boat somewhere around 50,000 years ago, having already crossed a genuine stretch of open ocean to get there, which itself implies real seafaring knowledge and capability. Wardey's dates suggest that the movement of people inward from that coastline, deep into brutal desert country, happened remarkably fast, not as some slow, tentative creep over tens of thousands of years, but as a comparatively rapid expansion by people who already understood how to adapt to difficult, unfamiliar terrain. It's worth being honest about how the discipline treats findings like this. Big claims about early dates are routinely challenged, retested, and argued over for years, and rightly so. Other important early sites in Australia have faced long and serious scientific scrutiny before their ages were widely accepted. What made Wardey difficult to dismiss was precisely that its two separate dating methods, applied to two different kinds of material, lined up so closely with one another. That agreement is what allowed the site to stand as confirmed evidence rather than a disputed outlier. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about a number like 49,000 years is what it actually represents. It is not the date these people first arrived at this shelter, and it is almost certainly not the earliest point at which people were living in this region at all. It is simply the oldest point that this particular shelter, this specific pocket of preserved sediment, happens to be able to prove. Archaeological sites like this survive only through an accumulation of environmental luck, the right kind of rock overhang, protection from flooding and wind, sediment that built up gradually rather than being scoured away. Far more sites than this one almost certainly existed across the same landscape and have simply been erased by time, weather, and geology, leaving no trace for anyone to ever recover. That fragility isn't only a problem of deep time either. Culturally and archaeologically significant sites across Australia remain vulnerable today, sometimes to mining, development, or simple neglect, and heritage protections have not always been strong enough to guarantee that another site like this one will survive long enough to be properly studied. Wardey was found because of pure chance, one man stepping into the right gorge at the right moment. There is no way to know how many other sites carrying an equally profound record of the deep human past are sitting undiscovered right now, or how many have already been lost before anyone had the chance to look up and notice a blackened ceiling on a distant cliff face. There is also a broader scientific debate sitting quietly underneath all of this. For a long time, researchers argued over whether Australia's giant animals had already vanished from climate pressures before humans ever pushed into the interior, or whether people arrived while the megafauna were still widespread and played some role in their eventual disappearance. A single juvenile diprotodon bone, resting in an early occupation layer beside human tools and fire residue, doesn't settle every part of that argument, but it does something important. It proves overlap. People and giant marsupials were sharing the same gorges, drinking from the same springs, at the same point in time. Whatever role hunting pressure ultimately played in the slow decline of Australia's megafauna, it did not happen in a world where humans and these animals were strangers to one another. What the shelter does confirm, beyond any real dispute, is that the people who occupied it were not simply scraping together a bare existence. They were making composite tools years ahead of anything comparable found elsewhere on the continent. They were grinding bone into precise, purposeful shapes. They were mining and applying pigment in ways that suggest symbolic or ceremonial meaning. They were hunting animals as large as a 3-ton marsupial and hauling the remains up a steep rock face to process and eat. And they were doing all of this roughly 49,000 years ago, in one of the harshest environments on Earth, passing that knowledge down deliberately from one generation to the next for tens of thousands of years afterward. It is, in every sense, a record of human ingenuity written not on paper or stone monuments, but in ash, bone, and ochre, waiting patiently under a cliff for someone to finally look up.